The HOA president sealed off the main entrance at the exact moment the emergency medical team was racing in to save my grandfather. Her justification? No access permits for the heritage zone during lunch hours. In her warped sense of order, bureaucracy outweighed a dying man's life collapsing onto 150-year-old wooden floorboards. When Grandpa's eyes finally closed, something within me shattered. She assumed, like every other time the HOA flexed its power, that this would quietly blow over. But what followed was a storm of vengeance even I hadn't thought myself capable of. Her downfall began during the somber hush of the funeral. That was the moment everything reversed. She became the one stripped of the land she once believed she ruled. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, because this tale begins with a silent crime and ends with a signature written not in ink, but in the blood-red stain of reclaimed ownership. No permits for heritage access during lunch hours. Victoria Ashford's voice cut through the sticky afternoon like a rusted knife. Her flawlessly manicured finger jabbed at the laminated quiet hours. 12 a 2 p.m. sign fastened to her wrought iron gate. Behind her designer Ray-Bans, her eyes glittered with satisfaction as the emergency lights bathed our Victorian home in desperate flashes of red and blue. Chris Rodriguez, the lead paramedic, was nearly on his knees now, clutching his trauma kit like a lifeline. "Ma'am, I'm begging you, we've got a 79-year-old man in cardiac arrest. Every second we're delayed could mean his death." But Victoria merely ran a hand through her platinum bob. Her HOA president badge caught the sunlight like it was a sacred relic of authority. "I don't care if the Pope himself is flatlining in there," she snapped. "Rules are rules. No emergency vehicles during quiet hours unless the appropriate forms have been submitted 3 copies in advance." The Caldwell House had stood since 1873, back when this land was all open fields and ambition. My great-great-grandfather Ezra built it from timber he cut with his own hands. The house had survived war, flood, and greed. Burn marks from Confederate trade still darkened the oak beams. The basement held stains from the Great Flood of 1927, and the front door bore scars from long-forgotten claim jumpers. This home had borne witness to generations of births, funerals, victories, and heartbreaks. It had sheltered runaway slaves, offered hiding space to bootleggers during Prohibition, and been the residence of 3 Purple Heart recipients. Yet, in its century and a half of existence, it had never seen anything as heartless as what was unfolding at that very moment. I pressed my face against the iron bars, feeling like an inmate as I watched Grandpa Harold convulse on the antique Persian rug in our foyer. His hands, the hands that had once written expose tilde copyright S, tearing down the powerful, clutched at his chest in agony. A line of blood traced down from the corner of his mouth, soaking into the family heirloom beneath him. His glasses lay crooked, making him look fragile, something I'd never associated with him. At 79, Harold Caldwell was still unmatched in wit and will. He published weekly columns, beat me at chess regularly, and quoted historical facts like a walking archive, but all his brilliance was no match for a failing heart and a woman hell-bent on petty control. "For God's sake, Victoria, he's dying," I shouted through the gate, my voice raw with panic. "Just open the damn gate. It'll take half a minute." Instead of responding with even an ounce of humanity, she pulled out her iPhone, activated her live stream, and set herself up perfectly in the golden light of late afternoon. Behind her, the chaos served as a dramatic backdrop. "Hello, my beautiful mindful warriors," she said sweetly to her audience. "Welcome back to another Mindful Monday meditation with your girl, Victoria." Her tone was syrupy, fake. Today's theme, preserving sacred boundaries and not allowing outside drama to invade our peace. She smiled serenely, as though the ambulance sirens were birdsong and the dying man behind her merely a shadow. "The truth is," she continued, "sometimes tough decisions must be made to maintain the harmony of our community. Even when people attempt to manipulate us emotionally." A broken bar. The bitter irony made me want to scream. This woman preaching about toxic energy was standing 20 feet from my grandfather as he slipped away. 3 decades earlier, she wasn't Victoria Ashford, lifestyle influencer. She was Dr. Victoria Marlowe, chief administrator at Mercy General. Back then, she routinely denied elderly patients the care they needed to boost profit margins. She faked records, pocketed kickbacks, and treated lives like line items. It was Grandpa who exposed her. Harold Caldwell spent 6 months building an airtight investigative piece that tore down her empire. His article, The Angel of Death, How Greed Kills, had shattered her reputation and her marriage. She lost everything, and on the courthouse steps, she vowed revenge. Now, years later, the chance for payback had finally arrived, and she was taking it. Time dragged as I watched Grandpa fade. Each breath came harder than the last. Chris barked into his radio, calling for anyone with authority to override this madness. "This is murder," he shouted at her. "You're killing him. I hope you're ready to live with that." But Victoria only adjusted her ring light and smiled. "And remember, my radiant souls," she cooed, "never let guilt tactics force you to compromise your principles." In what would become his final conscious act, Grandpa reached trembling fingers into his vest pocket. He pulled out his father's pocket watch, a solid gold, passed down from war to depression to family milestone. With the last of his strength, he flung it toward the gate. It struck with a heavy thud, much weightier than a watch should be. His lips moved barely a whisper. "Statue, Harold Lincoln," under the base. And then, at precisely 1:12 p.m. on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday, Harold Caldwell, my hero, our family's moral compass, took his final breath. Grandpa died on the floor of a home that had carried our family's legacy for a century and a half. Victoria ended her live stream with a chipper wave and her usual perky reminder to smash that subscribe button for more mindful living tips. Then, without a backward glance, she strutted away, her designer heels clicking across the pavement with maddening indifference. The EMTs eventually forced their way through the gate using bolt cutters, but it was too late. Chris knelt beside my grandfather's lifeless body and gave the smallest shake of his head. I stood there, still holding the warm pocket watch, and felt something inside me snap, not from grief, but from a deep, calculated hunger for justice. When Grandpa exhaled his final breath, the heat of that watch in my hand felt like it was pulling me towards something buried, a hidden truth he'd guarded for nearly 8 decades, a truth that would blow this entire situation wide open. 3 days after Will buried him, Victoria struck again. A bright yellow citation was taped to our front door like a slap in the face. The HOA's official letterhead practically glared at me, bold and threatening. Violation notice: unauthorized gathering exceeding occupancy limits during quiet hours. Fine, $500. Failure to comply will result in escalated enforcement measures. She had fined me for my own grandfather's funeral. Her claim? That more than 10 people in our home during community rest hours broke some obscure HOA regulation buried in a subsection no one had ever read. I crumpled the notice in my hand, the quiet anger I'd been nursing since that Tuesday solidifying into something colder, sharper. She thought paperwork could silence me, that bureaucracy could bury what she did. But Victoria had made one fatal miscalculation. She picked the wrong grandson to mess with. That evening, with the citation still burning a hole in my pocket, I walked to Harold Lincoln Memorial Park, just 3 blocks from our house. The statue of the town's namesake stood right where it always had, a generic bronze depiction of Lincoln that looked more like someone's middle-aged uncle than a historical figure. Most people barely noticed it anymore, just another piece of civic DA copyright core. But as I approached, Grandpa's pocket watch warm in my palm, I saw it with new eyes. The statue's base wasn't solid after all. Subtle seams were very well hidden, but visible to someone who knew to look. The watch ticked steadily in my hand, as if syncing with something deeper than time. I waited until after midnight, when the park was deserted and long shadows stretched across the ground. With the tiny tools on my keychain, I probed the statue's base and eventually felt a hidden mechanism click under my fingers. The watch slid perfectly into a concealed slot I never would have noticed without Grandpa's final whispered clue. There was a faint mechanical click, a precise, deliberate. A panel on the statue's base swung open on hidden hinges, like something straight out of an espionage film. Inside, sealed away behind military-grade waterproofing, sat an analog recording device unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't digital, it was an old-school masterpiece of engineering, lovingly maintained over decades. Grandpa had built a dead drop, a secure archive to store sensitive information, immune to house raids or digital theft. Attached to it were dozens of cassette tapes, each one labeled meticulously, some going back more than 20 years. Some tapes had initials. Others were cryptic codes that only made sense to someone who had spent a lifetime tracing corruption in the shadows. The preservation system was astonishing. The compressed air cartridges and desiccant packs had been swapped out regularly to keep the tapes in pristine condition despite the years. I grabbed the most recent ones and rushed home, heart pounding, hands trembling. I dusted off Grandpa's old cassette player from the basement, the machine still smelling faintly of wood polish and ink. The very first recording almost made me drop the player. Victoria's voice, crisp, unfiltered, it came through clearly. She was on a call with someone she referred to as Trevor. "Harold Caldwell is our last serious obstacle," she said with icy calm. "That property he sits on is the linchpin. It's holding together the entire strip of land we need for the resort project. His place alone is worth at least $50 million. Take him out, and the rest of the neighborhood folds within 6 months tops." As the tape rolled on, the details grew even darker. She and Trevor had researched Grandpa's medical history, pinpointed his heart condition, and outlined exactly how they could weaponize it. This wasn't spontaneous, it was orchestrated. But that was just the start. For the next several hours, I listened to the horrifying truth of Victoria's longamia. 2 decades of cold, methodical displacement. She built an empire on legal intimidation, manipulated diagnoses, and accidental emergencies that just so happened to strike elderly homeowners sitting on prime real estate. The recordings unveiled a full-blown network of corrupt city officials, compliant healthcare workers, property surveyors on her payroll. Each death, each eviction, each sale was calculated and profitable. Her knowledge of former patients' health histories gave her an inside edge. She knew exactly who was vulnerable and how to apply pressure. Trevor, who I now realized was her husband, handled the financials. His voice outlined market trends, appraisals, and projected ROI from each cleared parcel. Then came the tape that froze my blood cold. A recording from just 3 months earlier. "The next step," Victoria said, "is making sure Harold doesn't finish that expose copyright on Pine Valley. I've already been monitoring his prescriptions through our contact at the clinic. His heart meds were swapped with placebos last month. At this point, he's a walking time bomb." Trevor responded without hesitation, "With HOA emergency lockdown authority during quiet hours, you can delay ambulance access legally. If his heart gives out, all you have to do is follow protocol. Nobody will question a tragic, natural death." They'd planned everything. Every word, every delay, every breath Grandpa fought for in that front hall, and they thought they'd get away with it. It was no coincidence. The last cassette I listened to that night contained a chilling voice memo Victoria had recorded for herself, a casual note about her next moves and something she dubbed Project Clean Sweep. She spoke as if she were listing errands, not plotting murder. Phase 2, she explained, involved eliminating the heir before he could create obstacles during the property handover. She mentioned staging a traffic accident the following week as something that would appear entirely accidental. Then came the truly unnerving part, a detailed account of my daily habits that could only have been compiled through meticulous, long-term surveillance. The memo ended with her chirping a cheerful reminder to update the neighborhood newsletter with news about upcoming road safety enhancements. As I sat in Grandpa's study surrounded by physical proof of a conspiracy that had flourished in plain sight for over 20 years, I realized that Victoria had finally made a fatal misstep. She assumed that killing Harold would be the end of the story, that his secrets would die with him and his home would change hands without anyone asking too many questions. But Harold Caldwell hadn't spent 4 decades as an investigative journalist without learning how to safeguard the truth. He'd left behind the perfect contingency plan, a time-locked vault of evidence powerful enough to demand justice from beyond the grave. The pocket watch I held no longer felt like a family keepsake. It felt like a weapon, and tomorrow would mark the beginning of Victoria's reckoning. The next morning, I called Dr. Amanda Foster under the guise of settling Harold's outstanding medical bills. Her response turned my suspicions into irrefutable proof of foul play. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Dylan," she said, her voice laden with authentic sorrow. "I have to admit, I was shocked by how suddenly he declined. Just a few weeks ago, he was in better shape than most men half his age." She paused, the sound of paper shuffling on her end, But when I reviewed his file yesterday, something deeply troubling came up. Someone had been gradually replacing his heart medication with inactive pills. The pharmacy records show the prescriptions were filled correctly, but what your grandfather actually received contains 0 active ingredients. She hesitated. It looks like someone wanted to ensure his next cardiac event would be fatal. I asked who had access to Harold's medical records. Her answer chilled me to the bone. "Well, my staff has internal access, of course," she said. "But we're also required to submit updated health profiles to the county for senior residents' emergency preparedness, they call it." And Victoria Ashford, as HOA president, has been requesting quarterly summaries for everyone over 70, claims it's part of the community safety initiative. The final puzzle piece is locked into place with terrifying precision. Victoria hadn't just murdered my grandfather. She built an entire operation around monitoring, profiling, and strategically eliminating the elderly, all under the banner of community care. Using her position, she gained private access to medical records and wielded them like a scalpel. Dr. Foster's voice trembled slightly. "Now that I think about it, she's asked for the same kind of updates for several residents of Broken Bar, all of whom passed away in the last few years. I always assumed she was being overly cautious." That afternoon, I drove to the county courthouse to dig deeper into Victoria's past. Public records painted a portrait of a woman whose adult life had been shaped by one catastrophic humiliation. 3 decades ago, Victoria, then known as Dr. Victoria Marlowe, was a rising star at Mercy General Hospital. She'd been in line for a regional director position, poised to become one of the most influential healthcare administrators in the state. Then my grandfather started investigating a disturbing trend: increased mortality rates among elderly patients in her ward. 6 months later, his report hit the press like a thunderclap. His exposé tilde copyright, "The Angel of Death: How Efficiency Masked Greed and Cost Lives," ran for 3 straight weeks. It exposed a chilling pattern. Victoria had denied critical treatments to aging patients to cut costs, falsified cause of death records, and accepted kickbacks from pharmaceutical firms to prescribe cheaper, less effective drugs. I found the transcripts from her medical board hearing. They were damning and deeply unsettling. She didn't deny the accusations. She defended them. These patients were drains on the system, she declared under oath. They were consuming resources that could have saved younger, more viable individuals. I made allocation of decisions a efficient tone as a just like any responsible administrator would. The only difference is, I was honest enough to document them. Her complete lack of remorse so appalled the board that they not only stripped her of her medical license but also recommended criminal prosecution. Only a statute of limitations technicality spared her from prison. But her fall from grace was total. No hospital, clinic, or healthcare agency in the country would hire her again. The most horrifying part of the hearing came at the very end. As cameras rolled and reporters filled the gallery, she pointed directly at my grandfather and delivered what now felt like a prophecy. "Harold Caldwell destroyed everything I built because of his naive worship of the so-called sanctity of life. He cost me my career, my reputation, and my future at Broken Bar, all because he couldn't stomach the hard decisions real leadership demands. Someday, Mr. Caldwell, you'll need the very kind of medical care you've denied me the right to provide. And when that day comes, I hope you remember this memento, because your precious morality won't save you from its consequences." The deeper I dug, the darker it got. Further records showed that her husband, Trevor Ashford, had also once been in Grandpa's investigative crosshairs. 5 years after the Mercy General scandal, Harold exposed corruption in the county assessor's office. Trevor, then a junior appraiser, had been caught accepting bribes from developers, undervaluing land for insider deals, and inflating property taxes for elderly owners too frail or poor to fight back. Harold's reporting hadn't just exposed Victoria, it had also dismantled Trevor's career. The articles had cost him his job and sparked a federal investigation that nearly ended with a prison sentence. Like his wife, Trevor never forgave my grandfather, and like her, He spent decades crafting the perfect opportunity for revenge. The final puzzle piece fell into place from an unlikely source. Mrs. Ruth Caldwell, an 83-year-old neighbor who shared our surname but no relation, lived 2 blocks away and happened to be walking her elderly terrier when Victoria locked our gate that Tuesday afternoon. What she saw, and more importantly, what she captured on her phone, changed everything. I started recording because I thought I had to be imagining it. She told me when I visited her that night, that woman a broken bar, she wasn't just blocking the ambulance. She was enjoying it. She shook her head, tears welling. When your grandfather started screaming louder, she smiled. And not just a little smiley, she laughed. And when the screaming stopped, she did this little twirl before pulling out her phone for that live stream stunt. The video was shaky, muffled, but the visuals were unmistakable. Victoria's mask had slipped entirely during those 52 minutes. No pretense, no concern, just pure, gleeful malice. She laughed while Harold begged for help, checked her watch and smirked as his voice weakened, and the moment the cries went still, she applauded a clapped before launching into her faux spiritual influencer act. I've lived through a lot, Ruth said, handing me a flash drive with the footage. Wars, riots, recessions. But I've never seen evil that bled a broken bar and wearing designer heels. Driving home, the USB felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket. That's when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was short, blunt, and unmistakably threatening. Stop digging or you'll be with Granddaddy sooner than you planned. Accidents are easy to arrange. Victoria was watching me, tracking my movements, preparing her next move. What she didn't know, Harold Caldwell didn't just teach me chess or journalistic integrity. He taught me to fight back with precision. Victoria thought she ran the neighborhood. What she didn't realize was that I was about to turn her own surveillance network against her. She didn't waste any time making good on her threat. The next morning, 2 men in cheap suits showed up on my porch, reeking of intimidation and cheap cologne. One was broad and smug, the other wiry with faded prison tattoos creeping up his neck. Dylan Caldwell. The larger one asked, already knowing the answer, "We're here on behalf of Mrs. Ashford." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "You've got 48 hours to pack up and get out," the HOA board voted. "Your property's been declared a public nuisance. We're authorized to use whatever means necessary to ensure compliance." His partner cracked his knuckles slowly, deliberately. "Mrs. Ashford says people who ignore warnings tend to have broken bar accidents. Just ask your granddad." I didn't say a word, just closed the door in their faces. Then I got to work. Victoria had no idea about the one advantage I held. My day job as software engineering had taught me far more than how to write clean code. It had taught me how systems think, how they move, how they break. And Victoria's fatal flaw was that she couldn't help but document everything, control everything, catalog everything. If she was running an organized effort to target elderly homeowners, there would be digital trails, surveillance footage, communication logs, coordination tools. And in 2024, that meant data that could be hacked, traced, and turned against her. I spent 6 hours building an infiltration system that would have made my college cybersecurity professors proud and my employer very, very nervous. Hacking Victoria's home network was embarrassingly simple. Like most people who valued convenience over caution, she left everything on default settings. Her entire smart home system, cameras, doorbells, internal monitor cell was tied to one unsecured Wi-Fi network. The password, Victory Victoria 2024. Within minutes, I had full access. I could watch her in real time, rewind through her security footage, and comb through the archives she didn't even realize were backed up to the cloud. What I found made my skin crawl. Victoria hadn't just orchestrated Harold's death as she'd rehearsed it. Her own surveillance cameras captured her running drills, timing how long it took to chain the gate shut, practicing fake concerned expressions in the mirror, even adjusting her lighting for optimal livestream performance. She choreographed his death like a stage play. One video from 3 weeks earlier showed her pacing her living room on the phone. "Harold's next heart episode should hit within 2 weeks," she said calmly. "I've monitored his vitals through the neighborhood watch data. His stress levels are peaking. He's ripe for a major event." But the most damning footage came from her home office. There, mounted on one wall, was what could only be described as a serial killer's trophy display. 12 photos, each one an elderly resident who had died under unusual circumstances in the last decade, each marked with notes, acquisition dates, property values, causes of death, methods of elimination. In the center of the wall, Harold's photo stood out larger than the rest, circled in red ink with project priority number 1 scrawled beneath it. Surrounding him were neighborhood maps, medical files she had no legal right to possess, and printed screenshots from private surveillance. It didn't stop there. Archived footage showed her handing out envelopes of fat, unmarked with cash to a sheriff's deputy, a senior EMT supervisor, and what looked like a city planning official. In each exchange, she smiled and made comments about emergency protocols or public safety upgrades. She built a network, paid off officials, covered her tracks with lies about mindfulness, community standards, and progress. But now, I had her entire empire in my hands and it was about to fall apart. The context behind those videos left no room for doubt. Victoria wasn't just manipulating people, she was buying the silence of those who were supposed to protect the community from predators like her. One particular meeting with a paramedic supervisor was especially disturbing. Victoria spoke in chilling detail about orchestrating delays in emergency response times, and even arranging for technical failures in equipment it targeted specifically at certain homes, during specific time windows. These weren't hypothetical scenarios, they were part of an ongoing strategy. Trevor's involvement came into sharper focus as I reviewed more footage. He wasn't simply her husband, he was her strategist, accountant, and co-conspirator. The videos captured him conducting property appraisals, digging into residents' family backgrounds to identify those without nearby relatives, and managing exhaustive spreadsheets that calculated the profitability of each acquisition. In one recording, he casually explained that my grandfather's property alone was worth roughly $47 million in redevelopment potential once it was cleared. They discussed Harold's death like it was a business deal. Cold, clinical, detached. They weighed pros and cons with the same tone most people use to plan a vacation itinerary. The final, devastating piece of evidence came from Victoria's own smart home assistant. Though she never intentionally activated it, the device had been silently recording everything. Dozens of hours of conversations, some damning, others monstrous, sat archived in its internal memory. They didn't just talk about Harold, they mapped out future victims. 18 more elderly homeowners were on a hit list, each name accompanied by medical data, family history, and property estimates. A full-blown database of who was ready to be eliminated next. My name appeared on a separate document, labeled, "Complications to be resolved." Beside it were detailed steps for staging a fatal car crash, one that would appear completely accidental to investigators. While I was assembling all this digital evidence, my phone rang. It was Dr. Foster. "Dylan, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice taut with concern. "Victoria Ashford just contacted me. She's claiming you've been making threats against her, and that you're suffering some sort of psychotic break after your grandfather's death. She's trying to have you committed, and she has paperwork that honestly looks legitimate." It was audacious, even for her. Now she wasn't just trying to eliminate me physically, she was trying to discredit me completely, strip me of credibility, silence me under the guise of mental instability. But Victoria made a serious mistake. She thought I was fragile, that I'd collapse under pressure. What I actually was, a software engineer with a long fuse and no fear of violating federal cybersecurity laws, was something she couldn't calculate for. Later that night, I received another text, same untraceable number. "Last chance, Dylan, your psychiatric evaluation is tomorrow morning. After that, your problems disappear permanently." Smart boys know when they're beaten. But as I sat in my grandfather's study, bathed in the glow of 27 screens feeding live footage from Victoria's own security system, I smiled. She was about to learn the difference between being smart and being clever. Harold Caldwell had raised me to finish what he started, and I had learned that some wars aren't won with fists, they're won with strategy, patience, and overwhelming evidence. At 8 a.m. sharp the next morning, the evaluation order arrived by certified mail, carried by 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies. Their expressions told me they didn't enjoy their assignment. "Mr. Caldwell, The older one said gently. "We have a court order for an emergency psychological evaluation." Mrs. Ashford submitted documentation claiming you've been acting erratically since your grandfather's passing. He held up an official-looking folder, complete with a judge's signature and a recommendation from a psychiatrist I'd never even heard of. Victoria had cast her net wide deep enough to manipulate court officials, medical professionals, and law enforcement. While the deputies gave me a moment to collect my things, I sent a single, crucial message, a link to a secure cloud drive, forwarded to every major news outlet in the state. I included Mrs. Ruth Caldwell's contact information and a short note: "If anything happens to me, this is why." All the evidence I had gathered was now safely out of Victoria's reach, scattered across multiple encrypted servers, protected by dead man switches that would auto-distribute files if I failed to check in every 12 hours. She thought she was playing chess. What she didn't realize was I'd already flipped the board and moved to an entirely different game. The psychiatric facility was a private institution called Serenity Springs, and the kind of place designed for discreet removals, where wealthy families sent inconvenient relatives to be quietly locked away when they became too curious about family finances or inheritance issues. Dr. Marcus Webb, the man responsible for my evaluation, had the practiced tone of someone used to dissolving problems, not solving them. "Mr. Caldwell," he said with a rehearsed smile, "you've been under a great deal of stress, haven't you?" "Understandable, given your grandfather's death. But Mrs. Ashford and others in your community are concerned. They say you've been fixated on revenge fantasies, broken bar conspiracy theories, delusions." He spoke as he filled in blanks on a commitment form, blanks that had clearly been pre-filled. His mind was already made up, but he didn't know I'd done my research. On my drive to the facility, I dug up everything I could on Marcus Webb. He'd lost his medical license in Nevada after allegations of over-medicating seniors in long-term care facilities, keeping them doped up while their families emptied their bank accounts. He'd somehow secured a new license here, which meant only one thing: Victoria's network reached even deeper than I thought, right into the medical boards themselves. This wasn't just corruption, it was organized exploitation, and the man now judging my mental state was a seasoned abuser with a history nearly as disturbing as Victoria's. Dr. Webb's mistake: he underestimated who was sitting in front of him, and in his eagerness to seem thorough, he asked one question too many. Dr. Webb began probing with unnerving precision, asking pointed questions about my grandfather's medical records, my knowledge of Victoria's past, and my grasp of property law. There was no way he could have known so many intimate details unless someone had thoroughly briefed him in advance. "Tell me about these recording devices you believe your grandfather left behind," he said, flipping through an overly detailed set of notes that went far beyond the scope of a standard mental health intake. "Mrs. Ashford mentioned you've been insisting on the existence of audio evidence. These kinds of auditory fixations are common in grief-induced psychotic episodes." That slip revealed something critical. If Victoria had told him about the cassette tapes, which meant she knew about Harold's stash of evidence, but hadn't been able to find it, her confidence in having me institutionalized implied she believed that silencing me would neutralize any remaining threat to her operation. But she had no idea the most damning material was already out of her hands. Webb's interrogation also showed how far Victoria's surveillance extended. She was aware of my meetings with Dr. Foster, my visits to Mrs. Ruth, even my low-profile research trips to the county courthouse. But she hadn't detected my full-scale breach of her digital systems. I had eyes on her entire operation and she didn't know it. Then, mid-evaluation, Webb received a phone call he clearly assumed would be private. Unfortunately for him, I could hear every word through his speakerphone. It was Victoria, and this time, her carefully polished composure had cracked. "The commitment order needs to go through now," she snapped, her voice sharp and urgent. "There's clear family history of mental illness. He's made direct threats against community figures. Sedate him and keep him under observation until we finalize the property matters." Dr. Webb's calm, measured tone in response told me this wasn't the first time he'd done this for her, helping to disappear people who became inconvenient. But what chilled me more was what Victoria revealed next. "Trevor's getting anxious about the timeline. She continued, "We've already got buyers lined up for the Caldwell's property and 3 others. We can't move forward until the titles are clean. The kid needs to be ruled mentally unfit. If that doesn't work, a broken bar. Trevor has backup plans." The implication was unmistakable. If institutionalization failed, they'd kill me. And she was discussing it like she was rearranging a lunch reservation. Then the conversation took a darker turn. "What's the situation with Morrison?" she asked. The name hit me like a brick. Eleanor Morrison, one of the elderly homeowners whose accidental death Harold had been suspicious of. But apparently, she wasn't dead. "She's been sedated for 6 months, Webb replied. "But her family's starting to raise concerns. We may need to finalize that situation soon," Victoria said coldly. Webb reassured her that treatment protocols could be adjusted to ensure a more permanent resolution by the end of the week. I sat there, staring at this man as he casually discussed executing a drugged woman whose only crime was owning property Victoria wanted to steal. That was the moment I grasped the full scale of what Harold had uncovered. This wasn't about one family, or one neighborhood. Victoria and Trevor had built an entire operation, a well-oiled machine for erasing elderly homeowners and seizing their estates. They used forged psychiatric orders, corrupt doctors, and complicit judges to systemically defraud, imprison, or murder anyone who stood in the way. They had weaponized elder abuse into a criminal enterprise, and they'd been getting away with it for years. When Dr. Webb finally ended the call and turned back to me, a needle in hand and no hint of compassion on his face, I made a decision my grandfather would have respected. I didn't fight. I didn't flee. I simply smiled and asked, "Dr. Webb, a broken bar. Are you aware that Mrs. Ashford's smart home automatically records all her phone calls and that those recordings are now in the hands of the FBI?" The blood drained from his face. He knew. In that instant, he realized the commitment scheme had just become a key exhibit in a federal investigation and that Victoria, in her own living room, had unknowingly confessed to multiple murders. It took 3 months. 3 months of FBI-led interviews, forensic audits, financial tracing, and corroborated witness statements. The conspiracy they uncovered stretched so far and went so deep, it dominated state headlines. The woman who had murdered my grandfather while live-streaming guided meditation sessions was finally going to face consequences. And I had a front-row seat to watch her empire unravel in real time. On the first day of her trial, the federal courthouse overflowed. The building was packed, with crowds gathering outside to watch live streams on hastily assembled public monitors. This wasn't just a local scandal anymore, it was national news. The sheer audacity of the scheme had captured the public's imagination. Victoria Ashford, once praised as a wellness icon, had turned elder exploitation into a revenue stream. She had poisoned an entire county's legal and medical systems to shield her crimes. The press called her the mindful murderer. And now, every major news outlet had dispatched their top reporters to cover what prosecutors were calling the most methodical case of elder abuse in U.S. legal history. Presiding over the trial was Judge Patricia Wells, a formidable woman in her 60s, known for her ironclad rulings in high-profile federal cases. She wasted no time. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said firmly as the courtroom quieted, "we are here today to weigh allegations of conspiracy, murder, fraud, and racketeering, crimes that span over 20 years and involve the calculated targeting of vulnerable seniors." The air was heavy with tension. What no one in the courtroom knew not yet was that Judge Wells had a personal connection to the case, one that would prove pivotal before the trial was over. Federal prosecutor Sarah Chen took the floor with calm authority, methodically laying out the government's case. Her voice never wavered as she detailed what she described as a murder-for-profit enterprise cloaked in wellness branding and community outreach. She unveiled damning audio files, surveillance videos, and financial records. One by one, the pieces of Victoria's empire were exposed, and that was only the beginning. Dozens of witnesses took the stand, each adding another layer to the massive structure of Victoria's criminal enterprise. Their testimonies painted a chilling picture of her carefully orchestrated scheme. The defendant didn't just murder Harold Caldwell, Prosecutor Chen told the jury, her tone unwavering. filled with the gravity of truth. She executed a calculated campaign against 18 elderly residents across this county, systematically acquiring more than $200 million in real estate through deception, bribery, and premeditated killings. When it was my turn to testify, I stepped up carrying two things: a Harold's old pocket watch, and a tablet loaded with the digital evidence that had shattered Victoria's operation. The courtroom was so silent, you could hear the soft ticking of the watch as I was sworn in. Chen led me through my statement with precision, from Victoria chaining off our gate, to my discovery of Harold's hidden evidence stash, and finally to how I hacked into her surveillance system. It all unfolded before the court, but the moment that truly shook the room came when Chen asked me to play the phone call between Victoria and Dr. Webb. Victoria's voice echoed through the federal courtroom, cold and precise, as she spoke of my grandfather's death like it was part of a corporate strategy. Harold Caldwell is the last major barrier to the resort project. Her voice rang out. The old bastard owns prime land easily worth $50 million. His property is the linchpin. Once he's gone, the rest will sell or fold within 6 months. Gasps filled the room as jurors visibly reacted, horrified by the clinical way she scheduled a man's death to align with her live stream calendar, ensuring she had an alibi. But what truly shattered the court's composure was her laugh, light, almost playful, as she recalled watching Harold struggle for breath while the ambulance sat idle outside. The cruelty in her voice made stomachs turn. Victoria's defense team, stacked with high-priced attorneys known more for their prestige than any genuine belief in her innocence, attempted to humanize her. They portrayed her as a grieving widow, manipulated by her husband Trevor into participating in actions she supposedly didn't understand. They tried spinning a narrative of a woman traumatized by her own parents' poor end-of-life care, motivated albeit misguidedly by a desire to improve conditions for seniors. The jury wasn't buying it. Eyes rolled, heads shook. The story was too far-fetched to swallow. And then came the prosecution's rebuttal. Chen dismantled the defense with hard, irrefutable facts. She produced financial documents proving that Victoria directly benefited from every acquisition. She had planned the entire operation from day one. Her concern for the elderly was a front to one that led to 18 suspicious deaths and hundreds of millions in stolen assets. There were handwritten notes outlining victim profiles, including details about their medical conditions. Recordings captured her toasting successful acquisitions with champagne, followed by purchases of designer jewelry. Each artifact spoke louder than any testimony. But the moment that sealed Victoria's fate wasn't from the evidence or even a witness. It came from the bench. Judge Wells, composed but clearly shaken, interrupted just before closing arguments. "Before we proceed," she said, her voice heavy with emotion, "I must disclose a personal connection to this case, one I only became aware of recently." A wave of confusion swept through the courtroom as whispers broke out. Then she continued, "Eleanor Morrison, one of the named victims in this case, is my mother." Gasps erupted around the room. "For the past 6 months, I believed my mother had passed away peacefully at Serenity Springs Psychiatric Facility," she continued, eyes scanning the stunned courtroom. "Yesterday, I was informed that she had in fact been unlawfully committed, drugged, and was days away from being murdered when the investigation began. She is alive, recovering, and she will give testimony via video shortly." The courtroom descended into chaos as everyone processed the implications. Victoria had unknowingly brought her case before the daughter of one of her intended victims. The defense immediately filed for a mistrial. Judge Wells, however, remained composed and firm. She explained that after thorough consultation with federal judicial authorities, it had been determined that her personal connection strengthened, rather than compromised, her ability to deliver impartial justice. "I have every intention," she said, her voice like stone, "of seeing justice carried out in full." Judge Wells made her position crystal clear. "My commitment to ensuring this trial is conducted with exacting fairness and integrity," she said, "comes from knowing that any misstep in this courtroom or any procedural error would be a grave injustice to the victims and their families." Then came Eleanor Morrison's testimony via video. At 84 years old, and still recovering from months of forced sedation, her words carried a quiet but unshakable strength. Her voice, though soft at first, grew firmer as she recounted how she had been deceived into signing documents committing herself to a psychiatric facility. She was held there against her will while Victoria and Trevor falsified ownership transfers for her property. "I was kept in a constant haze," she said, voice gaining power with every sentence. "But I still knew enough to realize they were planning to kill me, just like they'd done to the others." She credited Harold Caldwell for saving her life, stating that it was the evidence he left behind that ultimately exposed the entire operation. By the time the prosecution rested its case, the courtroom already understood the outcome. The evidence was damning. The testimonies were heartbreaking. The sheer scope of the operation left no room for reasonable doubt. And yet, Victoria seemed completely detached from reality. During court recesses, she continued posting to her dwindling social media base, claiming she was a victim of persecution, a visionary woman targeted by jealous enemies bent on discrediting her work. She insisted her community reform model had been misunderstood, and that history would one day vindicate her. As Judge Wells prepared to instruct the jury, an uneasy silence settled over the room. Nearly 2 years had passed since Victoria Ashford had locked the gates shut and live-streamed while my grandfather died on the other side. Now, at last, justice was within grasp. This woman who turned the exploitation of elderly citizens into a business model was about to learn that not even the most elite legal team could shield her from the truth. And some truths, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of clawing their way back to light. The jury deliberated for precisely 47 minutes, the same cruel length of time Victoria had let my grandfather suffer while broadcasting mindfulness tips. When they returned, the forewoman stood up and delivered the verdict with calm finality: guilty on 18 counts of first-degree murder, along with conspiracy, racketeering, and federal fraud. Victoria Ashford was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Trevor Ashford, who had handled finances and operations, received 35 years. Dr. Marcus Webb got 25 years for his role in the psychiatric fraud scheme. A dozen other officials from across the county were soon indicted for accepting bribes or enabling the conspiracy. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came after the verdict, when Judge Wells addressed the civil repercussions of the case. Under federal racketeering laws, every property, asset, and dollar Victoria and Trevor had acquired over their 2-decade campaign of murder and manipulation was now subject to seizure. The court hereby orders the liquidation of all assets held by the defendants, estimated at $240 million, Judge Wells declared. The proceeds will be distributed to the victims' families and allocated to regional elder protection initiatives. Then she turned to me. "Mr. Dylan Caldwell, heir of Harold Caldwell and the individual responsible for bringing this conspiracy to light, is awarded full control of all HOA properties and assets, in recognition of the wrongful death of his grandfather." As I exited the courthouse that day, it felt like stepping into a new reality, one that barely resembled the world I'd lived in 4 months earlier. The HOA that had ruled our neighborhood with fear and manipulation now belonged to me, along with every home, account, and dollar Victoria had amassed through violence and fraud. The woman who once chained the gates shut to kill my grandfather now sat behind bars, her social media empire deleted, her so-called community initiative exposed for the predatory scam it truly was. But above all else, justice had brought something far more important than retribution: answers. 18 families finally understood what had happened to their loved ones. And the web of corruption that had empowered Victoria for so long was coming apart at the seams. The very first thing I did with my new authority over the HOA was exactly what Harold would have done. I called a mandatory meeting of every resident and announced the immediate repeal of every single rule, restriction, and policy Victoria had enforced. The quiet hours signs were the first to come down. Then went the access restrictions on the so-called heritage zone. And finally, the long, suffocating list of arbitrary regulations meant only to empower Victoria while keeping everyone else under her control. To be clear, I told the crowd gathered in the community center, from this moment forward, this neighborhood will operate under one rule: treat each other with basic decency. Everything else is optional. Rebuilding what Victoria had destroyed and turning her former empire into something meaningful became my life's new mission. I transformed the old HOA headquarters into something entirely new, The Harold Caldwell Center for Investigative Journalism, a nonprofit devoted to training emerging reporters and uncovering elder abuse across the nation. The very room where Victoria once plotted death became a sanctuary for senior citizens seeking legal support, medical advocacy, and protection services. I chose Ruth Caldwell to lead the organization as its first director. If anyone had the strength and resolve to confront abusers, it was the woman who had dared to capture Victoria's crimes in real time. On the exact spot where Victoria once chained our gate, I planted a memorial gardenia, an enduring symbol of remembrance and resilience. It became a place for grieving families to honor those they lost to abuse and for survivors to celebrate the lives they reclaimed thanks to Harold's final investigation. At the heart of the garden stood a bronze statue of my grandfather, and not heroic, not dramatic, and just him on a bench, typing away at his old machine, like he was waiting for his next big story to break. The plaque read, Harold Caldwell, a truth teller, justice seeker, grandfather. Some stories are too important to stay buried. Every morning, I sat beside that statue with my coffee and read the day's news to him, letting him know his last investigation was still sparking change across the country. The fallout from Victoria's trial extended far beyond our neighborhood. Federal probes were launched in 17 other states where suspicious deaths among elderly property owners had long gone unchallenged. 3 psychiatric institutions, operating under models eerily similar to Serenity Springs, were shut down. Their directors were arrested. Our case became a legal benchmark for dismantling systemic elder abuse. Investigative techniques I used to expose Victoria's digital and financial trail were being taught in police academies nationwide. My grandfather's final story had become a nationwide wake-up call, a call to protect seniors from those who exploit trust and authority for personal gain. 6 months after Victoria's sentencing, a letter arrived for me, forwarded from the federal prison where she was serving her life term. At first, I nearly tossed it unread, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a 3-page rambling manifesto in which Victoria declared herself the true victim. She insisted her revolutionary community management system had been twisted by corrupt prosecutors and misunderstood by a biased legal system. She expressed confidence that an appeals court would one day recognize her as a pioneer in elder care efficiency. She even invited me to visit her behind bars so she could explain the bigger picture. I never wrote back. Instead, I framed the letter and hung it in my grandfather's study, a constant reminder of what happens when ambition and ego completely eclipse empathy. It stood as proof of just how far someone can drift from reality when they see people as pawns instead of lives. While Victoria languished in prison, I dedicated my time to collaborating with federal prosecutors who were using our case as a blueprint for new investigations. Harold's final story was still unfolding, one conviction at a time, one survivor at a time, one broken system at a time. These days, when I pass the old gate where my grandfather drew his final breath, I no longer see the scene of a crime. I see the Harold Caldwell Memorial Garden, alive with community events, children laughing on playgrounds funded by seized assets, and families enjoying peace where fear once lived. I see the journalism center where young truth seekers are learning to follow trails of corruption and protect the defenseless. I see a neighborhood that remembers and vows never to forget. Each morning, I sit on that bench with my coffee and my grandfather's legacy, and I know justice may take time, but when it comes, it's worth every second of the wait. So if you're watching this and worried about elderly loved ones being mistreated by a homeowners association or hidden away in corrupt care facilities, know this: you're not alone. Every day, predators like Victoria use rules, regulations, and medical jargon to hide their abuse. But as Dylan proved, the truth always finds its way forward when even one person refuses to stop digging. Your grandparents, your parents, your neighbors, they deserve dignity, not exploitation. If you believe that justice should never have quiet hours, tap that like button, and subscribe to Ya Stories, because when the system fails, every family deserves someone who won't stop asking questions. That's all for today's HOA, but the battle over scrap heaps and silence continues tomorrow. From all of us at Ya Stories, thank you for watching. And remember, silence may be golden, unless your HOA thinks your wind chimes are too loud.